Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation, Automating the Mapping of Data Elements to Business Terms. Before we get started, let's review a few logistical items. Please feel free to ask questions as we go along by using your GoToWebinar controls. To post questions, please look on the right-hand side control panel. You should see a drop-down box for questions, and if you click on that box, you should be able to post your question at any time during the presentation. And we will address as many questions as time allows at the conclusion of the webinar. We do, however, expect today's program to be under an hour, given the content. We've also included 2 brief polls in today's webinar, so thank you in advance for your input. And we will be recording the webinar, and we'll send a link to that and the slides as well. So with that, I'll hand it over to Robert to get us started. Robert?
Thanks, Christy. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Many of you are probably familiar with Top Quadrant, but for those who may not be, just a very brief overview. We were founded in 2001, the same year that the vision of the semantic web was born. And since then, we've been engaged in applying that technology to create enterprise applications to make enterprise information meaningful. Some of you may have heard of this technology in with various names like semantic technology, semantic web link data, but more recently, it's become more widely known as knowledge graph technology. And since 2015, our focus has been to provide comprehensive data governance solutions based on knowledge graphs. Today's presenter is Irene Polikoff, CEO of Top Quadrant. Irene has a long career in information management, and she has deep expertise in applying knowledge graph technology to enterprise data governance challenges. In fact, she and several other Top Quadrant personnel have been instrumental in helping to create and shape the standards for knowledge graph through the W3C working groups. What she's going to cover today is informed by working with many industry customers over more than 25 years in related areas such as data management, data integration, data governance. Today, she'll first do a concise overview of what business glossaries and data catalogs are, what they capture, and how they are useful in data management and governance. She'll then explore how and why glossaries can be related to data catalogs. The core of the webinar, and probably your primary interest, will be the focus of the demo. She'll be looking at ways that data elements can be connected to glossary terms, why that task is large in scope usually, and how it can be automated. And we'll have time at the end to respond to some questions. With that, I'll turn it over to Irene.
Thank you, Robert. Hopefully this was a smooth transition and you now see my screen with the agenda. So let me get started with today's program and first talk a little bit about business glossaries. So a business glossary is essentially a set of definitions for some business terms that are key to an area of business operation, business community, etc. Every community and every organization has its own business language, has its own jargon. So if you are in finance, for example, you'll probably know about tax dividends and corporate actions, etc. If you're in insurance, then there is a certain meaning of the word case for you, which will be perhaps different meaning than if you were in support or if you were in some kind of a medical healthcare community. So it's important for us to have the well-crafted definitions of those business terms, and that's what business glossaries typically contain. They also may contain some business rules that will help us understand this terminology, this language even better. And maybe some other additional information that we will discuss further. What business glossaries typically, and I'm using the word typical because every organization that uses business glossary makes its own decision as to what exactly to capture there. But typically, each term is defined in a technology-independent way. This is why it is a business glossary. So information about data structure, for example, may not be present in a business glossary, or if it's present, it's present in a fairly generic and kind of a soft way. So business glossaries are maintained, created by groups of people, different subject matter experts from organizations, and they could be analysts, they could be called, business or data stewards. And it's not necessarily an easy job to create those well-defined definitions, and there are some best practices about what is a good definition, what is not so good definition. So it's well understood. Here's a small example of a business glossary and some information that may be present there. So you see a business term on the left, and you see alternative labels for some of those, so alternative terms for some of those terms. You see some definitions. You also see some organizational context, and in this case, it's all about payment methods, purchase terms, etc. So it's all used in the context of procurement. So why do we need business glossaries? Why they are so popular? Essentially because when you have a group of people working together, they need some common terminology, some common language, in order to achieve this shared understanding and shared meaning that when they use these words, they mean the same thing. And to avoid errors that results if we mean different things when we communicate with each other. So to expand on it in more details, since we are dealing with data, and business glossaries are actually used to explain organization's data or improve understanding of the organization's data. So every term that is in a glossary is probably manifests itself in data somehow, and that's why we're putting it in a glossary. So if we don't have a well-defined glossaries, then we could misunderstand the meanings of different terms, and then that could result in pretty egregious errors in when data is aggregated, when reports are produced, when business analytics are run, and ultimately even when data systems and applications processing data are being developed, because it's quite important for IT professionals, data users, to have the same understanding as other parts of organization, ultimately people responsible for business operations. And this is why an experience in a certain industry is so valuable when you are hiring your IT professionals, because you can be sure that they do understand the lingo. But of course, every organization is somewhat different. So even if you have someone with a finance experience, maybe the way certain terms are used in your organization are actually different from how they're used in some other parts of the industry. And all of this is captured and documented in business glossaries. When organizations have well-developed business glossaries, they are much more likely to be able to use their data more effectively. So we've had some small example of a little fragment of the business glossary, and we saw definitions. Of course, definitions are a key part of the information you have in the business glossary. What else may you have in a business glossary? Well, we also saw that there could be some alternative terms, because there are different synonyms that you may have for a given term. You could also assign some identifiers. to the terms. Acronyms are type of alternative terms. They, certain types of alternative terms that abbreviate things. Documentation definition is an important part of the documentation, but definition itself, no matter how well crafted, may not be sufficient. So you do need a precise definition, but you may also want to expanded definition that talks specifically, for example, about the purpose, maybe has some scope notes or editorial notes, maybe provide some links to documents where people could gather more information about a term. Now on to rules. And rules can become an important part of the glossary, especially in the context of our today's webinar, when we're talking about linking data elements to the business glossaries, to glossary terms. So rules can be just stated in a human readable way, just in a regular language, that say that a date is a date and it has to be expressed in a certain format, for example. But they could also be stated in more of a machine processable way that will then help us connect data to the appropriate business terms. And in the demo, we'll see examples of it. Permissible values is also a kind of a rule, and this type of information is useful when you dealing with terms that can have controlled values, let's say genders or country codes, or frequent flyer status. So in case of permissible values for the frequent flyer status, it could be gold, platinum, silver, and then green will not work because it's not part of that control specified set of values. So that could also be considered to be a rule as to what actual values are permitted for a given term. Another important part of the glossary is talking about who is responsible for it. The stewardship. So these are the people who may be a subject matter experts. These are the people that may be stewards, people who are responsible for maintaining the definition, people who you could ask more questions about it. Some terms get superseded by other terms, so effective dates, statuses can become important. Superseded is a kind of a relationship that you could have between terms. There's other generic relationships that exist between terms. You could talk about one term being broader than another. You could talk about terms being the same. You could talk about them being somewhat related. So there's a set of generic relationships that you may want to use in your glossary. And that helps to understand things better, and that could also help in automating some processes for connecting business terms with this data. There are more specific relationships that you may want to have in a business glossary, and they could deal with traceability. For example, traceability between a term and some requirements. It could be a compliance requirement. Traceability between data elements and terms. Another type of a relationship is, and we saw it in the earlier example, that a relationship between an organization that uses the term. So this is how the term is used in customer support. This is how the term is used in sales and marketing and so on. And they may be somewhat of different terms, but they actually mean the same. So that's another relationship. Or maybe they sound the same, but they actually don't mean the same in the context of different organizations and different business activities or processes. And I've already mentioned compliance, and that's connection to regulations. For example, in the context of privacy or security. There could be some terms that are special, and therefore data associated with those terms need to have special treatment. Speaking of relationships, here's another quick example. We see 3 terms here with their definition: purchase order, blanket purchase order, payment terms. When you look at them, you realize that of course they have some kind of a relationship between those terms, and those relationships can be different. So blanket purchase order is a kind of a purchase order, so there's a broad and narrow relationship between those terms. You could also say that a payment method maybe is narrower than the payment terms, because payment terms include a method of payment as well. But then you could start thinking about the structural aspect. So when you talk about purchase order and let's say purchase order number, both of those could be terms, but what is the relationship between them? Is it broad or narrow, or is it something more specific, such as contains, saying that you could find a purchase order number in a purchase order, you could find delivery terms in a purchase order, etc. That becomes a question of whether you want to start using this type of specific relationships, and whether you want to start capturing the structure, which structure, even if it's in such a not precise ways, because structure is typically something that is associated with the data sources where you have very precise physical structure in play. So with that, and before we go to the data catalogs and talk a little bit about them, maybe this is a good time, Christy, to ask a question about where people are with their use of business glossaries. And we're asking to just select one of the choices as to how you're working with business glossaries today.
Yep. Thanks, Irene. We've got some people already voting, so we'll give you guys another few seconds to get your answer in. And thank you for taking a few seconds to do that. We're going to wrap that up in a second, and then I will share the results for everyone to see. Some votes are still coming in. Let's go ahead and close the poll and share these results. There you go.
Okay. That, yeah, that's not surprising. We actually, I think the largest category of people have glossaries, and they're using spreadsheets and informal processes to work with glossaries. I think that reflects what we often hear as well. But it's interesting that also many people, the second category was that many people actually using glossaries actively in their data management processes, and that's good, because that's ultimately the intention and the promise of business glossaries. So let me move on and talk a little bit about data catalogs. Data catalogs essentially represent the other part of the picture. So on the business glossary side, we have a lot of definitions. People are involved heavily in creating those glossaries and building consensus about those definitions, and capturing them in a precise way, and so on. With catalogs, every organization has many different data sources, and by data sources we mean things like databases, data sets, there's data warehouses. So various places where organizational data lives. And each of those data sources, to some degree or another, contains metadata about this data. So what happens with a catalog is that you could go out and crawl and examine those data sources and create a catalog of them. Typically, you'd have all the available metadata that you could capture from a data source in that catalog. You may also have some data sampling to help understand the data, because sometimes just based on the metadata, it's hard to understand. So a little sample always helps. For some catalogs, you will have links for access and ability to download the data, such as data sets, or just simply link to a page where you could request access to some source. And a number of other information that we will look at shortly. Previously, data catalogs is actually not a new concept. In the past, there were similar systems called data dictionaries, metadata registries that resemble data catalogs quite a bit. I think today's data catalogs are more of a social construction because they are now available to a much broader number of stakeholders, not just technical stakeholders, but a lot of other actors in the organization. Quite often, data catalogs are created automatically by, just as I said, crawling your data sources. So you could gather a lot of information from the data sources. And just as I had an example of the business glossaries, here's an example of the kind of information you may have in the data catalog. So here we have, in this particular example, this is a part of the catalog or a catalog for a database. So we see some database columns. We see some physical data types. The names are qualified by using the table name in parentheses. So this is famous Northwind database. And then the asset name is just the name of the column. You see the connection to the table that this is a column of, and you see some of the type of information that could be gathered by ways of profiling and statistics, just what is the total number of values for this particular column, for this particular data element. And if we were to zoom in on one of those columns, then we would see even more information. Again, something that you could get from the source. Is this value generated? Is this value nullable? How many distinct values we have? That's also be part of profiling and statistics. And of course, it is connected to the table. So we could see what is the total number of records in that table. We could also see, what are the other columns in that table. And at the level of the table or at the level of data set, this is typically where representative data sample, an example, could be captured if you decide to keep this kind of samples in your data catalog. They are quite useful for automating connections between data elements and business terms. And they also useful to help understand the data. However, if you do this, then it becomes important to obfuscate things that may be personally identifiable, or maybe, keep the sample only as part of automating the mapping process, but then discard it and actually don't show that. We see organizations using both of those approaches. So speaking of organizations using data catalogs, what are the data catalogs are used for? A way to shop for data, a way to understand what data is available in an organization, where is it located, how can it be accessed, who is responsible for it, who is publishing this data, who is using this data, and ultimately this is in order to find the data, and also in order to do various things with data, again, such as create reports, or maybe aggregate it, or maybe translate from one data source to another data source. So all of those activities are supported by data catalogs. And of course, data scientists, for example, is a fairly new category of stakeholders that use data catalogs quite heavily because they want to source data sets that they work with, and they want to understand where they come from, what they represent, what's their quality, and so on. So what kind of information do we see typically captured in a data catalog? Well, similarly to the business glossaries, you may have some names, such as column names. You may have some identifiers associated with data elements. It is possible to have descriptions, although the descriptions will not be gathered from the data source. So the descriptions would be something that would be then created, entered post-crawling, post-cataloging process. And stewardship associated information then also becomes available. So who is responsible for this data source? Who may be able to provide documentation and so on. Since it's a data catalog, we'd have quite a bit of information about the data structure, data types. Is it an integer? Is it a string? Is it a blob? What is the size of the fields? If it's a database, we may have information about primary and foreign keys, nullable, etc. We would also possibly have data samples and some traceability information, such as mapping to business terms, mapping to organization processes, requirements. Data access is another type of information that you see in the data catalog, and that could include not just a link to the access point, but actually more expanded information about the method of access, the kind of format that you will get by downloading a data set, maybe an APIs that you could use to access a particular data source. All right, actually traceability is, there's a little bit of a repetition here. Data quality, can we trust this data? And data quality can be something that is just provided with a data source, created by a person who is responsible for it, or maybe crowdsourced from the people who are accessing the data catalog and expressing their opinion on the data quality. So that's one approach to getting data quality information. Another approach is actually if you have formal processes in place where a data source is assessed for the data quality, and there's some kind of a issue identification process that runs, then you could capture that in a data catalog and say, well, this data source was scanned on such and such date, 5 issues were identified, maybe type of an issue, etc. And that gives a better understanding of how much of a trust can you put in this data, what are exactly the problems that users need to be aware of, whether they're important to them or not. Again, compliance, there are some regulations that are relevant to data, and depending on the nature of data source, there could be other categories or aspects with which to tag the data. So if this data has geographic aspect to it, like location aspect to it. Then there may be some geographical tags that have to do either with things like countries or maybe even coordinates or specific locations, cities, etc. Temporal is another common aspect associated with data. Is given this data source, what dates are in scope, what dates are being covered in this data set. You could have exactly the same data sets, but for different locations and for different temporal periods. And there can be other categories of this kind. It's just that temporal and geographic are ones that are very commonly used. Social aspect could have been put into a category actually outside of it, because it's again information about who uses it and any kind of endorsements that the users could give to a data source, and even just the information on how many people have accessed it, how many people have downloaded it, determines how popular a data source is. So that's kind of an important part of the information to the data catalog. And that is also something that could be captured automatically, not in the process of necessarily cataloging data, but maybe in the process of provisioning the data catalog. So just looking at how many people looked at this data source and maybe went to the access point, or maybe requested access to a data source. Because search and findability are so important to data catalogs, I decided to show another kind of way to present a data catalog by using simply a free text search. So you always want your glossary to be searchable. You always want your data catalog to be searchable, and for that search to be fairly rich. So you could enter key terms and then look at the various categories of facets where you could narrow what you're interested in more by by the publisher, by possibly some things like theme, which is a category, or maybe by contact point distribution method, by physical data type. You're looking for everything that is of a certain type, and so on. So that's having a catalog search is important. And since we talked about user comments, so giving users to gather this type of a social data, to gather endorsements, you will want to have something like that in the catalog. Visualizations and diagrams are also always of interest to users. So far, we have been talking about primarily databases and data columns, and in my demo, I will also be using databases and data columns. But I wanted to give an example of more data set focused catalog information, just like a previous screenshot, and this one as well. We're zooming into a data set now, possibly found in this catalog, and we see some description, we see some statuses, and then we also see the kind of statistics on the record counts that you could get, and some social metadata on the count of users, and then structural on a number of data elements that are part of this data set. And looking at a specific data element, we could get more information as well, including, here's a good example of permissible values. So here we're talking about an age, but not an age as an absolute number of how old someone is, but rather in this particular data set, they're dealing with age as kind of a controlled vocabulary, because they have categories of ages. So they have, one is under 65, 2 is between 65 and 69. So it's a very specific treatment of age, and this is why it has permissible values and the meaning of each of the value. So with this, why do we want to connect data catalogs? Because I think we've just established that the data elements are housed, captured in a data catalog. So why would we want to connect a data catalog with a business glossary? Well, essentially because in the data catalog, we are documenting data assets. We are capturing them from the source typically. And yes, we could add more information by ways of descriptions and get stewards involved, etc. But we don't really have a business or operational context in the catalog as part of the cataloging process. It's something that's added by people. And when we look at an individual data element, such as an employee ID or a purchase number, order, or whatever, we'll probably have similar data elements across many data sources. So documenting them at the data element level is a big chore. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of repetition. Now, that kind of documentation is already available in the business glossaries. We have semantics there. We have business context there, what organizations is using it, possibly, what regulations applies, etc. So if we could connect data elements to the terms in the business glossary, then we get all this business context, all these definitions. We don't have to specify them at each data element level. They could basically inherit it from the associated business terms. So this is a good way of adding a lot of business context, a lot of business meaning, a lot of semantics, a lot of this broader information about processes, regulations, way of using something to the data elements in a data catalog. And now it's probably is a good point, Christy, at which to ask attendees about their use of data catalogs.
Everyone should see the survey, the poll. Looks like we've got some votes coming in, so thank you for taking a few seconds to respond. We'll give it another couple seconds. Lots of voting still happening. Okay, I think I'll go ahead and close the poll and I will share the results. There you go.
Okay. All right. Well, interesting that we only have a small group of people that actually have connections to business glossaries, and that probably explains why people are interested in this webinar, because ultimately that's what we want to talk about: how to create connections. Well, obviously you could create connections manually. So you have people who are knowledgeable about the data sources. There is a lot of expertise in the organization, and they could establish those connections. The problem with that is that it is a very large task. It's a tedious task, and you have lots of data. In some cases, this is still the most reliable way, and in some cases, maybe even the only way. But there's also ways to do something like this automatically. And when you're doing it automatically, there's a number of approaches that the software or tool could take to help this connection. So when I talk to customers, the most common one that comes to mind when you talk about automating. Everyone asks, well, can you just look at the name of the data element or a name of the data column and just do some kind of a fuzzy matching based on the name? And yes, of course you can, and that can be a useful approach. However, we're all data professionals. We've probably all looked at databases and data sets with very obscure names of columns and not necessarily that reliable. So that's one approach. It cannot be fully relied on, and it works better with some data sources. So if you have a database with very well-crafted names of columns, then that's gonna work better than in some other circumstances. So it depends on the data source. Another quite useful approach has to do with using the data itself. So how do you use the data? Because your data catalog is not going to have all the data. I mean, all the data in the enterprise is huge. You're not going to put it in the data catalog. What you could have in the data catalog, though, is some statistics about the data, and that could already be useful. Metadata can be useful. So is it a string versus an integer? That already gives you some indication. How long is a field? How many characters? What the max value? What's the min value? That gives you some indication. And data samples give you a good indication as well, because then you could actually sample some subset of the data and use that to ultimately build the connection. So this is a good point at which to break into a short demo. That let me escape and switch to a browser that I want to do. And to give you context, I am in TopBraid EDG, TopBraid Enterprise Data Governance. This is a product that we provide that lets customers manage both business glossaries with workflows, stewardships, and all associated processes, as well as to catalog data sources and connect them. So here we are looking at a small business glossary. Excuse me, and we see the kind of information that is available, for example, for employee ID. So there is a bit of a definition here. We've got some connection to organizations, to business activity. We have something called a data value rule. So let's see how this may look like. And the data value rule is something that is processable, something that could actually be used by computer algorithms to create the connection between a data element and a business term. So you see here that it's a string, and it's always 12 characters in length, and has a certain pattern to it. So you could see that from that rule, we would be able to actually, if we looked at the data, we would be able to build the connections at least to some degree of certainty. And when you're automating this type of connectivity, there's always kind of human in the loop that will need to confirm the connectivity. So here's just some of the available fields. If I wanted to look at the more of the available fields, you see some information about the status. There could also be stewardship information. There's additional documentation fields. There are some relationships. There's this traceability that provides the connection to data elements, and so on. And as far as the rules, you will see that there's also permissible values where you could associate to reference data sets or any kind of controlled vocabularies if it makes sense. And you also see that there's business rule in addition to the data value rule. So what could be an example of the data value rule versus a business rule is here's an example of a gender. So the business rule could be something that is expressed by a data steward or a business steward in just plain English language. So it's one of the following. While when we're going into the data rule, this is where it starts to be more machine processable, and we could have information that will specifically help us identify that if you got these values, then it is likely to represent gender. So with this, let's switch to our data catalog and see how information can be connected. Let's see how the data catalog may look like. So in this particular catalog, I just have a database employees with some tables. So you see department number, employees, salaries, and so on. So the employees may be a good table to look at. We see that it has quite a number of records. We've got here as an example, of course, normally this would be sensitive information, but I wanted to, this of course are fictional things, but I wanted to provide it to help understand the example. So we could see exactly how employee IDs in this case look like, first, last names, gender, etc. And we could drill down to see some specific information about, let's say employee ID. So you see that it aligns with in the links that we specified in the business glossary. It's got some data quality records, so that's an example of where the quality is captured, and we see how exactly it was captured, the number of issues, how many values were verified, etc. So useful information for a data catalog. Now, frequencies, a good example of frequencies, because that is something that could also be used for matching, is available for something like gender. It doesn't really make sense to do frequencies for employee IDs because every employee would have a unique ID, hopefully. But something like gender, you'd have frequency information because it's essentially an enumerated value or value from a controlled reference data set. So we see here that it's either M or F, and we see the number of frequencies. So anytime you have a relatively small number of values compared to the total number of values in a table or in a data set, then the frequency analysis would be done, and that could also be used to help this automation of matching. So in order to automate matching, I mean, I could actually do it one by one by enabling this problems and suggestions factor, function, and just to help this, because I'm going to have more information now. We could look at it as in tabs. And now in traceability, we've got some suggestions that say, okay, based on the sample data, and we have a small sample, and that gives us some amount of confidence, but it's a small sample. And based on the min month links, the suggestion would be to map this column to the employee ID term. And so happens that in this case, our terminology fits well. We have employee ID here, we have employee ID in the glossary, but this suggestion does not rely at all on matching the name of the column. It really relies on data and on profiling and on sampling. So we could do it by looking at the individual data element, but of course, you'd probably want to do it for the entire data source, and I'm gonna switch to a view that will let me do this for the entire data source and just run matching here. Can enable suggestions. Sorry. Enable creation of suggestions. And you see that I've identified quite a number, or the system identified to me a few matchings. So we saw the employee ID match. We also saw a gender match, and in this case, that's based on the frequencies, because we have two out of 2 frequency statistics. Based on that, we've got some salary matching, which is based on compatible value constraints. I know that in the rule for glossary, we have something that says that the salary needs to be between, let's say, 25,000 and 150,000. So that's founded based on this type of calculation. Interestingly, it's also suggested that the employee number should be matched to salary, which is, we know, is not a good suggestion. And that's because here the suggestion is just based on a number, and you could probably, when you look at your data sources, you could find lots of different numbers that would fit, that are numbers and would fit within that, value range. So this kind of suggestions are considered to be less of a confidence, and if we were to increase our confidence that we want to use for this particular mapping, this kind of suggestions would disappear. Now, in terms of mapping based on the names, I'm gonna, just the names of the columns, I'm gonna show that as well using something we call crosswalks. So the crosswalks, instead of keeping that mapping directly with the data catalog, you could kind of keep the mapping in the data set itself, called the crosswalk, and then include it in your data catalog. Managing mapping separately from managing data directly gathered from the source is actually a good practice and a good technique, because your sources change, and the process for changing sources is kind of separate from the process for establishing mapping. So I'm gonna here bring the suggestion confidence to 75% and run the mapping here. And as you see, we've got let me bring the confidence a little bit higher. So we've got more mappings here. And now, in addition to the mapping on ID, we also have first name mapping, which is just based on the first name. We've got gender mapping that is based on frequencies, as well as on the mapping of the actual name of the column. We've got last name mapping, and we have salary mapping. We no longer have the suggestion to map the employer number to salary, because we raised our confidence level, and mapping just that is based just on falling within the range of value is a softer, is a lesser of the confidence than mapping, let's say, based on frequency or based on the data samples and the matching of the names. So that gives you an example of how you could automate mapping of data elements to the business terms. It could provide you with ways to automatically create mappings, review them, change your criteria, use different approaches, and then ultimately make a decision and perhaps apply your top suggestions. This is typically always combined with human in the loop type of curation and processes. In conclusion, I want to open it for questions a little bit, and
Thank you,
sure
Irene.
Probably have some interesting questions.
Yeah, we got a lot of questions and a lot of requests, that so much so that we could probably do a follow-up, but let's go ahead and see what we have. If you haven't already, submit your question or discussion point in the question box, and if we don't get to it today, we will definitely respond to you via email, so your questions will be answered. Let's go ahead and get a couple in. Let's start with this one, Irene. How do you implement repeatable processes in an organization to perform these connections?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So in case of with our product, and that's fairly typical, I think, there are workflows, and you could, for example, so the automated process, right, can become part of the workflow. So you could have a workflow that automatically crawls a data source for cataloging, and then that kicks the process for automatically creating mapping suggestions. The mapping suggestions can be generated and then presented to a person to curate them. Or maybe you could set some confidence levels where you could say, well, if it's 100%, it should be accepted, and other things we could curate. But that lets you route this through approval, and also lets you schedule this type of processes and do it on a regular basis, be it weekly or maybe triggered by the change of the data source. But definitely this kind of processes are important, and it's important to associate roles with both data sources and business terms, so that the right people are involved in this automated process.
Thank you, Irene. Another question. In your experience, do organizations try to connect all of their data assets or data elements, or is there some type of prioritization?
Also, very good question. Quite often, organizations identify key business terms, and then they run this connection only for the key business terms, because not all the data is equally important to organizations. And since even this automation, there is some effort to to confirm that this is correct, and review, and this whole human in the loop. So it's still quite a bit of work. So yeah, organizations may start with something that is critically important to them, and then maybe expand that. But ultimately, as you start building connections, you're getting better and better all the time, and you've already established some. So it's a matter of incrementally adding data sources.
Another quick question. Is the glossary a logical view and the catalog physical?
You could put it that way. Yeah, the catalog is definitely a physical view, because it talks about the structure. It talks about the actual physical assets, the actual database, the actual file that represents a data set. So that definitely is a physical view. But incorporating then connections to a glossary brings business context. Some organizations actually talk about kind of a business view, a logical view, and a physical view, where by a logical view they mean there are logical data models like you do with the UML tool, and they have logical attributes, and they have logical entities. So in this case, the connections may be from a physical data element to a logical attribute or a logical relationship, and then from there to a glossary term, which is really more business oriented. It's kind of a progression. So that type of linkage is we see that as well, especially for organizations that have this discipline where they're doing a lot of logical data modeling.
Right. And I think with that said, we'll go ahead and wrap up. It's after the hour. We do have a lot of questions that we were not able to get to, but we will be responding to those questions. So please be on the lookout for answers to the questions, as well as today's recording and slides as well. Thank you so much for your time today, and have a wonderful day. Thanks so much. Bye.